and we're going to go ahead and get started with Pro Tools. So here's the Pro Tools intro. Whenever you open up Pro Tools, you're going to be greeted by this screen right here. This is the dashboard, and depending on what you've been doing in Pro Tools, you're either going to see the Create menu, the Reset menu, or the Projects menu. Now, the Projects menu is something that you have to be signed in for, because projects are things that happen online and in the cloud. I personally never use projects with Pro Tools. So you'll see in here, mine always says sign in. I never sign in. I don't really need Pro Tools to be connected to the internet. I don't care about it being connected to the internet. I'm kind of old school the way I use Pro Tools. I kind of do everything just in my studio on my computer. And if I want to take it and work with somebody on it, then I will send them the files and they can open it up and use it. That's how I've been working so far, because most of what I do for my production is actually not in Pro Tools. I'm not using Pro Tools as much as I used to, just because I've shifted over to other programs. But this is where we start here: Create, Recent, and Projects. Usually you're going to start with Create, unless you're working on recent projects, then you're going to go into Recent. Now, Recent is a lot of projects that you've been working on, you guessed it, recently. It's everything that you may have been opening up in the past few weeks or something like that. So you'll see a lot of things in here. You can see all the different classes I've been teaching in here. And oh, Brianna, you love the pandas? Awesome. Great. I'm going to try to switch it up actually with the pandas, and so it's not just going to be pandas all the time. In the past, it's been pandas all the time, but I'm personally getting a little bit tired of pandas, so I think I might go with some kittens or puppies or bats. Who knows? All right, anyway, let's get back to the Pro Tools here. So the screen that you really need to pay attention to is the Create window. This Create window has a lot of interesting information on it, and this is also where we're going to check in with the notes over here. So in the notes, it kind of shows you what you want to use. It shows you the options, and it shows you with these little stars here what I recommend. So let's just kind of go over this real quick. You can follow along with the notes. You can follow along in Pro Tools if you've got it. The only thing I request if you're following along in Pro Tools is that if you are trying to do it with me, I am going to go a little bit quickly. So if you get kind of lost or kind of a little bit far behind, just kind of catch up, because I can't keep stopping and going back and stopping and going back. That's what the video is for up on YouTube. Realistically, if you get a little bit lost, just go back and watch the video after I post it up in class, or talk to me about it in Zoom. The Zoom is where we can do a lot of Q&A, like real-time Q&A, and I can show you stuff on my screen, things like that. So here's Pro Tools. What I'm going to do is I'm going to name this session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this one Pro Tools Introduction. You can name it anything you want. And I'm just going to put the class in here, 2105 A1. So that's that there. And now you can also say, where do you want to store the session? Usually it's going to be local storage if it's a session, but if you are collaborating with somebody else online, you can click on this button. But this means it's going to be a project and you must sign in. You can see that I have not signed in. So if I click on this, it's really not going to do anything. The other thing down here is create from template. We are going to talk about the templates on another lesson. So I'm going to kind of skip over this for right now. Just kind of let it be known that for most of these early sessions, and for a lot of sessions that you're going to be working on in the beginning, you really don't need create from template. Create from template kind of comes into play after you have some experience working in a studio or working on projects, things like that. That's kind of where create from template kind of comes into play. So we're going to start with local storage session, and I'm just going to go down here, and this stuff here is the stuff that may be a little bit on the confusing side of stuff. So let's just kind of go into this and talk about what we're looking at here. So first of all, here is the file type. That is, you can choose from a WAV file or an AIFF file. Now, Macintosh computers, Apple computers by default can be AIF. That's the Apple file format that they made. But I recommend using WAV, and you can see here, if we kind of go back and we look at the notes here, I recommend using WAV, and the reason why I recommend using WAV is because it is the most compatible. It says it right here, the most compatible. All computers can use WAV files with no problem, so it just makes it a little bit easier for everybody. But these days, realistically, all the Windows machines can also read WAV, it can also read AIF files. So you could use AIF files, but I do recommend using WAV. They sound the same. They basically do the same things. The only thing that's really the difference between AIF and WAV files is that AIF can have information in the file. For example, it can have like what I would call like header information, meaning that you can store a picture with it. So when you look at it on your computer, it has like a little picture, or it can tell you some information about it that the WAV files can't. But honestly, you don't need that stuff. So WAV file it is. Next over here is sample rate. Now you can see my sample rates are a little bit limited. I've only got 44.1, 48, 88.2, and 96 kilohertz. I've got these right here. Now let's just take a step back and talk about what these things mean. And I've got a little bit in here, and we're just talking about really broad strokes right now. Basically, audio, and that means like CD audio, like anything that you're going to listen to, is at 44,100 hertz. That's 44.1 kilohertz. That's an audio file. That's what you would record onto a CD if you're burning CDs. And that's kind of the standard that we're still using at this point for whatever reason. I don't know why. It's just kind of where we're going with this. If you wanted to be fancy and you want to double it up, then you can use 88.2 kilohertz or 44.1, because when you downgrade from 88.2, the computer likes to be half or double. Computers like to keep things half or double. So 88.2 or 44.1 for audio stuff. So if you are doing music and you're working in audio, I highly, highly recommend that you just keep everything at 44.1, or if you want to be fancy about it, 88.2. I don't recommend it. It's going to take up double the space on your hard drive, which we're going to talk about in just a second. I really recommend just doing everything at 44.1. Now, the 48 and the 96, as we can see here, is for video. If you're doing stuff that's going to end up on digital video, they do all the digital video at 48,000 hertz. That's 48 kilohertz. So if you want to be fancy with your video stuff, then do it at 96K. But again, if you're doing video, I recommend 48K. People will argue about you can hear the difference, you can't hear the difference. And yeah, it does affect things minimally, but realistically, people can't tell. And that's the bottom line, is people can't tell the difference. Your normal person who's listening to your audio cannot tell the difference. So let's save space on our hard drives. Let's make things a little bit easier on our computer, because when you do everything at double, it's actually doubling up everything. It's doubling up the processing that the computer has to deal with. It's doubling up the amount of space that the file is taking on your hard drive. So if I'm doing stuff at 88.2 or 96K, that's going to be double the processing, double the space on my hard drive. Why do I need to do that to my computer? The answer is I don't. I don't need to do it to my computer. So let's keep things simple. Let's keep things easier. Do stuff at 44.1, or if you're doing video, 48. All right, so hopefully that helps with that a little bit, just kind of understanding what's going on there with that sample rate. Now, the bit depth. The bit depth, we have several options here. And if we look at this chart that I've got here, the notes, the 16-bit is CD quality. Again, that's kind of the standard is CD quality, right? In the case of the bit depth, not exactly. I recommend doing everything at 24-bit. Even though that's not CD quality, 24-bit does make a difference, and it's not doubling up stuff like up here with our sample rate. Sample rate, everything's like doubled or more. With bit depth, it's not doubled. 24 is not double of 16, and bit depth does make a bigger difference because it really has to do with your dynamic range. So the bit depth is actually more important than the sample rate to me. I'm sure people will argue about that with me, and that's fine. Bring it on. I will probably just mute you because I don't care. But the bit depth, let's do the bit depth at 24-bit for now. In the future, things may ramp up to 32-bit a lot more. I know that Ableton Live does all its bouncing and everything at 32-bit. But for now, if I have control over stuff, I do everything at 24-bit and kind of call it a day. So that's this one right here, 24-bit. The bit depth should always be 24-bit. And then your I/O settings. The I/O settings is the labels that Pro Tools puts on things, the labels it uses for your tracks, the labels it uses for your track, track I/O. The I/O is the input output. The I stands for input, the O stands for output, I/O, input output. And this is how Pro Tools labels all the inputs and outputs in your session according to what's connected to your computer, the audio interface. So in my case, I'm just going to use the stereo mix, and this is really what I recommend that you use. We are going to come back and talk about the I/O settings and talk about what all these things do and how you can change these. But for now, I always recommend that you use stereo mix. Now, the thing about Pro Tools is Pro Tools will use the last I/O that it was using, which means if I bring a session from SAE school and I used different I/O settings because it was at SAE, if I bring that setup into my home computer, if I put it on a hard drive, bring it to my home computer and load it up, well, the next time I open up Pro Tools, if I say last used, it's going to use my SAE I/O settings, which doesn't really make a lot of sense if I'm working at home. So my recommendation, anywhere you are, is that you always use stereo mix unless you have a reason not to. If you know that you should use one of these other settings, and again, you can make your own settings, you can import settings from other places. We're going to go over that another time. But if you have something that you know you're going to use other settings for, then you can use one of these other setups. But if you don't know what the other settings are supposed to be, if you're a little bit confused about that, I recommend using the stereo mix. I do not recommend using last used unless you're only working at home all the time and you're always using the same I/O settings and you know that you're always using the same I/O settings. When I was working in Japan, I just used last used all the time, partially because I didn't really understand the I/O settings, but also partially because I was just doing everything in my home studio and I wasn't getting stuff from another studio usually. I was usually sending stuff to another studio, not getting stuff from another studio. So I was just always using last used, and it works fine if you're always starting sessions from the same computer, the same setup. So when in doubt, use stereo mix. If you know that everything's always the same all the time, then use last used. But I recommend stereo mix. So there we go there. Now over here, interleaved. Remember what I said on the first day of class. If you have a choice, click interleaved. The only time you should not click interleaved is if you are sure that you don't want to use interleaved. But again, just like the I/O settings, when in doubt, use stereo mix. With interleaved, when in doubt, use interleaved. Always. If you see an option for interleaved, use interleaved. Okay? You're going to see really 2 or 3 places where interleaved comes into play. The first place is here in the beginning when you're starting a session. Another place that you're going to use it is when you are committing a track. I think interleaved is an option for committing stuff, I think, or maybe bouncing out from a track is interleaved as an option. And then when you're bouncing out your entire song, then interleaved is also an option. We're going to talk about that kind of at the end of things today or tomorrow. Then finally down here, where you're going to save the session. Where does it want to save? Well, you can have it so it's going to ask you where you want to save it every time. Or if you always want to save your Pro Tools project into the same place every time, you can click on this button right here. Now, I've got it set up so it's always saving my Pro Tools projects into a thing called Pro Tools Projects, or it probably should be called Pro Tools Sessions. But I have it saving into the same place every time. So after I click this Create button, it's just going to do it. If you click Prompt for Location, it will ask you where you want to save it. Now, my advice, and this is really, really important, my advice is that you make a note of where you save stuff. Be organized. Save stuff in the same place all the time. Don't save it into the same Pro Tools session folder, which we're going to talk about at the end of class today, but make sure you save it somewhere where you know where it is. So, for example, we're just going to go through this process here, Prompt for Location, so you can see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and hit Create. Now it's going to ask me where do I want to save this session? So where I'd like to save the session, like a little piece of something on my screen here, where I want to save the session for me is in my sound folder, and then in the Pro Tools projects. It's down here, Pro Tools projects. I click on that, and then I can double click it to open it, and now it'll put it into here. I'm not going to put it into any one of these folders, because if I do, things are going to get confusing really fast. And actually, during the Zoom class today, we're going to talk about this again. So if I forget, please remind me, hey, Tony, you wanted to go over saving your Pro Tools sessions again. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to hit save. I'm not going to click on any of the folders in here. I'm going to click save. And now it's going to go ahead and create a Pro Tools session for me. Now, where did this save on my hard drive? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my Finder menu. And here, let's make a new Finder menu here. This is if I make a new Finder, it pops up like this. And I'm going to go in here to my sound over here on the left. And I'm going to click on Pro Tools projects. And now it should be in here. What did I call this? Pro Tools Introduction. There it is. Right there. You can see where it showed up. And if I double click this folder to open it, now we're going to see all this stuff inside of here. We're going to come back and talk about all the stuff inside of here. But this is what you should see. You should not see a million Pro Tools files. You shouldn't see a bunch of these PTX files here. If you see a bunch of these other files, or you don't see an audio files folder, or you don't see a bounce files folder, stuff like that, then something went wrong and you saved it in the wrong place. You should really only see this one file right here, and it should say the same name as the folder that you just opened. So this folder here says Pro Tools Introduction 2105 A1, because that's the name of the class. That's what we're talking about today. So if I double click it in here, now the Pro Tools session should say the same thing. This is very, very important. I've seen people get very confused about this stuff, and they're like opening there's like a million Pro Tools files and things are all over the place. We need to make sure that does not happen. That really, if that's happening, we need to stop that right in the beginning. So if you're confused about where to save your Pro Tools session file, that's fine. Please come talk to me. This guy right here with the hair and the face and the smile, this guy, please come talk to me so that we can fix that as soon as possible. All right, cool. So that session there is this right here, what we're looking at. So just go back over here. Just make sure all the stuff in the notes, we've covered everything. IO settings, stereo mix, interleave, turn it on. Great. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what interleaved means. And to do that, what we're going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go into, let's see here, let's go to Pro Tools Lab 1. I'm going to use the audio files from Pro Tools Lab 1 just so we have some stuff to work with in here. And I'll use the drum loop in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag this in real quick to my session, and it ends up in here. Now, what we're looking at, before I go any further, let's just go a quick overview of what we're looking at. This is my edit window. In Pro Tools, there are two main windows, the mix window and the edit window, and they're very easy to tell apart. The mix window looks like, well, right now it looks like a gray screen, but if I add some tracks in here, let's add like 3 audio tracks, and let's see here, let's add 2 aux inputs, and let's add a master fader, and let's add an instrument track. All right, so if I hit all these, this is what Pro Tools will look like. This is what my mix window looks like, and you can see it looks like a mixer. This is what it looks like. We've got faders here, and we've got places for plugins and inserts and sends and ins and outs and all the stuff we're going to talk about, so you know what we're looking at here. We're not going to talk about it right now, though, because it's a little bit, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But this is the mix window. The mix window is where you mix, which kind of makes sense, right? That it's called the mix window because it's where you mix. The other window is called the edit window, because guess what you do in the edit window? You edit, right? There's 2 main windows, the mix window and the edit window. They're very, very well named. The edit window is where you edit stuff. The mix window is where you mix stuff. Hey, now I can mix stuff. I can mix stuff in the edit window as well, but I cannot edit stuff in the mix window. I know I just maybe, whoa, Tony, hold on a second. What? Right? Okay, so we're going to talk about this in just a second, but we can show things over here so you can actually do mixing stuff. Let me just show you real quick. If I make this bigger, you see over here on the left-hand side, here's a volume. If I click that, I can pull it up and down. I can adjust the volume. I can double-click it. Can I double-click it? I thought I could double-click it. I can't double-click it here. I can double-click it on the other one, I think. But I can move it up and down right here, so I can adjust my volume level. I can move my pan back and forth right here. I can change my inputs. I can change my outputs. I can actually make, I can show my inserts and my sends. So I can do lots of mix stuff in the edit window. But if I look over here at my mix window, the mix window, I cannot do any edit things in here. There's no way to do edit stuff. And if I double click down here, it's not, I thought it would let me, oh well, okay, that's fine, whatever. I thought it would let me double click, but I might just be too used to other programs. All right, so in here, this is my mix window, and this is my edit window over here. Now, inside the edit window, over on the left-hand side, we also have our tracks list. And if they're all highlighted like this, what I can do is I can hold down my Option on a Mac or Alt key on a Windows machine, and I can click it, and I can deselect them, and I can move things around. See this? So I just moved audio 1 down here. I can move audio 1 all the way down here. And you can see if I move it down here, it also moves it over here. And it also moves it over here. And I have the same window over here in my mix window here. This track show hide list, that's over here in both windows. So we're going to come back and talk about all this stuff. I don't want to get too deep into it right now. I'm just kind of showing you a brief overview of everything. Down here in the bottom left-hand corner, in both windows, my mix window and my edit window, down here, we've got our groups over here, and this will be very important later on. We don't need to worry about the groups today, but they will come into play later on, and they'll be very, very important. On the right-hand side over here is my clips list. The clips list is where all of your audio and MIDI clips live. So the audio, any kind of audio that you drag into your session, it's going to live over here on the right-hand side. Any MIDI clips that you drag in or that you create, they're also going to live over here on the right-hand side. We're going to talk about that more in just a moment, but I just wanted to let you know what's going on over here. And then across the top is our toolbar. We've got lots of things we can see up here in the toolbar. And depending on how big your monitor is, you can show more or less things. Right now, I'm working on a small 13-inch MacBook Air monitor, so I'm not really looking at that many things. Over here on the left-hand side, I've got my edit mode, and then here I've got my tools, and here I've got some like magnification stuff, and then over here I've got like my counters and my visual stuff where I can see what's going on, where I am down here. If I move my cursor around, you can see it shows me where my cursor is right here. Let me just zoom in on that for you a second. So see that, how that moves around? It's just showing me where I am on my timeline. And then over here, I've got my grid mode, I've got my nudge amount, and then here I've got what they call the transport. And then over here is like a little stereo output meter path, so I can see what's happening with my output meter. And then here I can click on this, so I can actually show or hide more things. So for example, if I don't want to see my zoom controls, let me just click on this. I can get rid of my zoom controls, or I can get rid of my transport right here. I can show or hide more stuff. I don't want to show too much because look, now my MIDI controls are off the screen here. So I don't really want to show too much. If I want to see that stuff, there are other windows that we can open up. So those are the main windows, the mix window and the edit window here. I'm just going to go ahead and on my mix window, I'm going to go ahead and close this little track show hide area. So I click on this and it closes it right there. See that? See how that closes that? So I click on that and it closes it because I don't need to see it in my mix window. I was kind of surprised that it was open, to be honest. But I'm going to leave it open in this window over here. I'm also going to, for the time being, I'm going to not show my sends. We don't really need the sends right now, but I'm going to keep everything else open. I'm also going to go in here and I'm going to delete some of these tracks that I made. I highlight them and I right click and I select delete, and it deletes all my tracks. I'm going to leave open this audio track right here. So now I have an audio track. Now, let's just talk about this audio track for just a second, because I just want to show you something here. This audio track is, let's see here, where is it? Okay, it's not in the notes for today, it's in the notes for tomorrow actually. But the audio track, this is a mono audio track. Now, mono versus stereo. Stereo is left and right, mono is just one signal. Stereo is 2 channels, mono is 1 channel. Mono is like right in the middle. I can pan it left and right because my overall output is stereo. Again, we're going to come back and talk about more of that tomorrow, but I just want to illustrate this whole idea of interleaved. That's kind of where we're going with all this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another mono audio track. So I have 2 mono audio tracks, and I can label this one left, and I can label it by double clicking, and I'm going to label this one right. And then I'm also going to come down here, I'm going to make one more audio track, and I'm going to call this one stereo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these 2 the same color. Let's make them both green, and I'm going to leave this one over here. I'm going to leave this one over here purple. I need to close you. There we go. Okay, so we have this one, these ones that are green, this one that's purple. Now, why I'm making this is because I want to show you the difference between interleaved and non-interleaved. So let's go back to our notes, and let's look at this here. This is the interleaved versus non-interleaved. So this loop, and right now it's just called drum loop, right over here, and we can see that this is a stereo file. Now this clip, we can see it's stereo because it says stereo, which, hey, look at that. How obvious is that? And then also we can see it's stereo if it's got this little triangle here. And if we drop the triangle down, it's going to say drumloop.l and drumloop.r. Now, what I can do, and this is actually really cool because this is something that only Pro Tools does, is I can drag in my drumloop.l, make that a little bit smaller so you can see the wave file, zoom in on it. Actually, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to put this all the way over at the beginning. There we go. And I'm going to zoom in so we can see things easier. And I can also drag in my drumloop.r. So now I've got the left and the right, and we can see they're actually 2 separate audio files. Now, if I did not have stereo, if I did not have interleaved turned on, it would only be these left and right files. It would not have a stereo file right here. But because I have interleaved turned on, I can actually just grab this one file and just put it down here on the stereo track. And this is what interleaved does for us. Interleaved allows us to use stereo files as stereo. If I'm doing things as non-interleaved, it's going to separate everything out into 2 mono files. And we don't really want to do that anymore. If you go to a studio where the people are very into multiple mono files, then they might say, hey, don't do anything interleaved, do everything as multiple mono files, and you'll say, okay, whatever, fine. If they're doing it at a studio, then you should be doing it at that studio. But if you're just working on your own, or if you're working at your own studio, I highly, 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 highly recommend that you do everything interleaved. Turn on interleaved at all times. Okay, so interleaved is basically, we've got one file, one wave file. It's right here, the drum loop. If I look on my hard drive, here it is right here, drumloop.wave. It's one file, and I can pull it in as one file. But Pro Tools has the extra step of actually allowing you to separate it out, which is something that Logic or Ableton Live or FL Studio do not allow you to do. A non-interleaved file is 2 separate files, and it would look like a bunch of these right here, and it would actually say .l and .r. Now, here's the thing, is that these take up the same amount of space on your hard drive. So this wave file here, if it's a stereo file and it's 10 megabytes, if I separate it into 2 mono files, each one of those mono files is half of the equation. It's half of the wave file, the original wave file. So each one is going to be 5 megabytes, 2 separate 5 megabyte files. There are 2 mono files here. So I've got one 10 megabyte file if it's interleaved, or I've got 2 5 megabyte files if it's non-interleaved. And that's how that works. But the problem is And this is why I really recommend you do everything interleaved, is because if you pull something into iTunes, or you throw it on your iPhone or your Android or your MP3 player, whatever you've got, if you have a non-interleaved file, it's going to be mono. It's going to be playing the same thing on both your left and right headphone speakers, or your speakers in your car, or whatever. So you're not going to hear any of that stereo information. You're only going to be hearing half of the song. Not the first half or the last half. You're going to be hearing the left half or the right half. So you really want to be hearing both halves. You want to hear the stereo file. So make sure that you interleave everything so that people can hear things as you intended for them to be heard, which is stereo. All right. So I hope you understand. Okay. So Carlos says, would there be any benefits to having them separated? And the answer is yes. If you're working with bass frequencies, it's kind of better to work with mono files for bass frequencies. But here's the trick. Here's the thing, is that nowadays Logic and Ableton Live both record everything as stereo, unless you're recording like a microphone. If you're recording something from the outside world, then you can make it mono or stereo because of the microphone. But if you're recording something internally, like an effect or a keyboard, if you commit a keyboard line or something like that, even if it's a mono instrument or a mono file to begin with, Ableton Live, Logic, both change it into a stereo file. So you kind of end up working with stereo files quite often anyway. And those programs don't really differentiate between mono and stereo so much anymore. Ableton Live recently did add the ability to separate your panning into two stereo pan knobs like Pro Tools does, which we'll talk about in just a second. But realistically, there's not a big reason to work with mono files. You can make the track mono. People will use the argument that it does take up more hard drive space, because if you see here, this 5 megabyte, there's two 5 megabyte files and versus one 10 megabyte file. So if it's like something that's like a bass line and it's really low, it's like a sub bass or a kick drum, like a sub kick drum part, then you might want to turn that into mono if you want to. But the only place you can really turn it into mono anyway is in Pro Tools. In Ableton Live and Logic, you have to take a plugin and then make that plugin be mono. The file is still stereo, but the plugin makes it mono. For mixing purposes, it's better that way. But the only one that allows you to actually create a mono file from a stereo file is Pro Tools, and you do it like this. Let me go ahead and delete these because we don't really need to look at these anymore. So here is my stereo file, and what I can do is I can right click on this, and I can go down here and I can go to split into mono. Now, this is something you're not going to use very often, but it's actually very important to know how to do it, because it allows us to take, if somebody sends you like a sub bass or something, like they're working, they've got a sub bass for a trap song or something like that, you may want to take that that bass file and split it into two mono files for the mix. And you just go over here, you right click on the track name, you go split into mono, and it makes two mono files, .l and .r, and then what you do is you just get rid of one of them. So I just right click on this one and I just delete it, and I can delete my original stereo file, and now I've just got my left file. The only thing we have to be aware of is that the pan for this will be all the way to the left. So I can just hold down Option and click on it, or Alt on a Windows machine, and now it puts it right in the middle. So if that's the situation you're in and you really want to make a stereo file into a mono file, then that's what you do. You right click and you select split into mono, and there you go. But as I just said, in Logic or Ableton Live, that's not even an option. So if you're working in another program besides Pro Tools, you're just gonna have to do this a slightly different way. So it's not even a thing. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and delete all these tracks, so we end up with no tracks. Now, this does bring up something that I want to point out here, is that you notice that I deleted all my tracks, but my clip, my audio, is still in the session. And I want to point this out because Pro Tools does not connect the tracks to the clips directly. When you delete a track that has a clip on it, go over here and drag that in. So if I drag that in, it creates a track for me automatically, and it's got it in here. And if I delete this track, right click, select delete, it's gonna warn me. It's gonna say, hey, the track drum loop contains active clips. Do you still want to delete it? The answer is probably yes, just delete it. But the clip, any clip that you made, is still over here in your clips list. So you're not deleting the clips out of your session, you're just deleting the track out of the session. So the clips are still there. I actually really love this. Logic and Pro Tools both work like this for audio. Pro Tools works like this for audio and MIDI. Logic does not do the same thing for MIDI clips. Ableton Live doesn't do it like this. If you delete a track, it deletes all the audio out of your session. It's actually really annoying, and that's something I really don't like about Ableton Live. I wish they had a clips list or something like that, like they do in Pro Tools, but it's not the end of the world. You just have to be careful that you don't delete tracks. And if you delete a track in Ableton Live, you can just undo it. Here's a fun fact. In Pro Tools, if you delete a track, you cannot undo it. Just let that sink in. How horrible is that? If you delete a track in Pro Tools, any kind of track in Pro Tools, you cannot undo it. This is probably why deleting a track in Pro Tools is kind of a hassle. You have to right click on the track and select delete. You cannot just hit the delete key on your computer keyboard. It's not going to work like that. So be aware, if you want to delete a track in Pro Tools, you have to right click and select delete. Okay, let's go look at our preview again over here, and let's talk a little bit about, keep going with the windows here. In the windows, we're going to come back and talk about these plugins here in a second. In the main windows here, we have in the edit window, we've got the timeline and we've got the edit window view. The timeline goes across the top, and the edit window view goes up and down on the left-hand side of things. And that's this over here. What I'm going to do for now is I'm going to close this. Hold on, let me put this back in here. Great. I'm going to close these windows on the side just for to make things a little bit more clear. This right here is our timeline. This is our timeline. And on the left-hand side, we can see there's a little box right here. This box is probably going to become a pretty good friend because you're probably going to show things and hide things and stuff like that. And what we can do is we can click on this box, and down here, we can show or hide different things. So if I'm working on, I usually like to show and hide my minutes and seconds, so I can see my minutes and seconds. If you're working on a film or something, you might want to have time code. If you might want to have feet and frames, or you may even want to have samples if you're doing sample editing and stuff like that. But for the most part, if you're working with music, you really only need to have bars and beats and minutes and seconds. Now, below that, we can also show our markers, tempo, and meter. You can also show key and chords. I really recommend that you have these three things shown right here. If I want to unshow them, I can just unshow them, and you can see how they disappear right here. I don't really need to have my key being shown usually, but there you go. If you want to show the key and you can put in key changes and stuff like that, you can do that. Or if you're working with guitar players a lot, or songwriting stuff, and you want to show the chords, you can show chords in here as well. But I don't usually show my chords or my key. The key I probably should be showing more, but I don't for now. Markers, tempo, and meter. We will talk about these three things in other classes on other days, but you should be showing those. And they all show up right here and over here. Now, this little marker thing shows up on whatever my what I have selected. So if I select minutes and seconds, see how it changes to this one right here. I cannot click on these down here. The reason why I can click on these up here is because this is actually showing me what my main counter is showing me. So the main counter is actually connected to this over here on the left-hand side. And if I click on this, you can see this one's grayed out. That's because that's what my counter is showing me as well. I highly recommend that you, if this is a bit confusing for you, I really recommend that you go and you watch the video again and kind of play with it to kind of get a feel for what it's showing you. The easiest way to understand this stuff really is to play with it and click on things and just kind of look at what's happening. But what's happening is right now this is showing me my bars and beats, but I can click on this little arrow here to change that, and I can change any one of these things to minutes and seconds. I could even put time code in here. If I put time code, it's going to flip what I'm looking at here. Really what I want to have is minutes and seconds though, not time code, unless you're working with a movie. I like to have beats, bars and beats be what's showing here on my main counter. If I want to show two things in the main counter, I can do that. I can show the sub counter, and the sub counter in this case will be, it shows me samples here because that's the last thing I selected. Let's go ahead and change that to minutes and seconds. What I recommend if you're making music is that your main counter shows bars and beats, and that your sub counter shows minutes and seconds. And I recommend that you have both of them up here. I think it's very useful to have both of them up here at the top. So again, just to reiterate that, we can hide, we can change which one is controlling Pro Tools and which one is in our main counter. I recommend bars and beats is always the one in control of stuff. Now, we can also do the same thing with this left-hand column over here, which is our edit window, view hide stuff. And we can click on this little thing right here to show or hide more things. So if I click on this, I've got comments here, I've got mic preamps, I've got instruments, inserts A and E, or inserts F and J, which is just more inserts, sends A through E, or sends F through J, which is just more sends. And then I've got my I/O, which is my input and output, my connection to the hardware world or to other tracks in Pro Tools. And then I've got my real-time properties here, and then I've got my track color. Now, as you probably noticed, I only had a few of these displayed when we opened up our session. Just inserts A through E, I/O, and track color. And the reason why is because I'm on quite a small screen. If I zoom out all the way, if I have all this stuff showing, let me just go ahead and turn all that stuff back on again. And I've got a 13-inch monitor here. Look at that. That is so much display for a small monitor. It's not enough. I don't want to be editing in this little window over here on the right-hand side. The whole point of this is the edit window, right? So I want to turn most of these things off. Let me just go ahead and turn these off. Boom. Because I want to have most of my real estate being for editing stuff. Okay, so I can make this bigger and I can zoom in. There we go. Great. Okay, I can zoom out so I can see what I'm doing. Now, here's the thing, is that if I go over to my mix window, the mix window allows me to see all of that stuff I was just showing you in the edit window on the edit window side of things. So down here in the bottom corner, I've got my mix window view selector. Click on that and I can show all the same stuff with one exception. Now I have an extra thing here for heat. I can show all this stuff down here, and I've also got an extra thing for delay compensation. So I can zoom out here and you can see it still goes off the bottom of my screen because this is a very small monitor. And I've got all this stuff that I can view here. Okay. I don't need to view all of this stuff. I'm not using heat. I'm not using instruments right now. I'm not using, I don't need my comments. There's a lot of stuff I don't really need. I don't need delay compensation right now. So I'm going to go ahead and hide all that stuff because I like to have it so everything fits on one screen. So this is really all the stuff that I like to show. I don't really show my EQ curve usually because I don't use the stock EQ that comes with Pro Tools, so I don't use that EQ curve. If you're used to Logic and you want to use the stock EQ that comes with Pro Tools, by all means, please use that EQ curve if you want to see it. Logic shows that automatically. Pro Tools does not. You can turn it on and off. All right, but now, as we can see, I can actually view a lot more stuff on my screen. I don't have to scroll up and down. It's all right here so I can see it really, really quickly. That's how I like to have my computer set up. You might be different. This is not something that I'm going to harass you about, except I really do recommend that you, with the inserts A through E and sends A through E, I don't really recommend that you show F through J unless you're constantly using 10 or more than 5 inserts or sends. If you're using more than 5 inserts or sends all the time, then you should show those. But if you're not using more than 5 very often, then you don't need to show those things. So really for big sessions, or as you get better with your plugins and stuff like that, then you can start showing that stuff. But for now, I like to keep it simple so I can just glance at it and see what's going on with stuff. All right. So let's go back here to the plugins here and just talk about these plugins, because this does connect up with our track types here in a second. Basically, it's like this. A plugin is a program within a program. Now, you've probably talked about plugins at some point in Mod 1 with Logic. So a plugin is a program within a program, and there's different types of plugins. There's effects and there's instruments. The effects basically change the sound in some way. The audio runs through an effect plugin and it changes the sound. It can be an EQ, making it brighter or darker, using gain knobs on different frequencies. It can be a compressor to control your dynamic range. It can be a reverb to give it some sound of a room or an environment. Or it can be an instrument plugin. An instrument plugin creates the sound from itself. It creates the sound within itself. So an instrument plugin is like a synthesizer or a sampler or a drum machine or something like that. Okay, and different tracks can have different types of plugins, which we're going to talk about after when we get to the different track types. So what this little box here is illustrating is that we've got our main program is Pro Tools, and inside of Pro Tools live all of the plugins. Usually plugins are programs that you cannot use outside of the main program. So for example, if you do a lot of video editing or a lot of photo editing, there are plugins that work with Photoshop or Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro, stuff like that. There are plugins that work for those, just like there are plugins that work for Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton Live. Native plugins are first-party plugins. They come with the program. Okay, that's what like a native or a first-party plugin is. It's a program that comes with the program. It's a plugin that comes with the program. So on Pro Tools, when you download Pro Tools, remember all that stuff I showed you yesterday to where to go and download Pro Tools, and then I said we get to the plugins and that it comes with, and you'd have to download all those as well. All that extra stuff, that's all stuff that comes with Pro Tools. It's all made by Avid, or it's made by a company called Air, or I guess Air is M-Audio stuff, or is Air its own company? I don't remember right now. But basically, it's made. They come with the program, and for the most part, they're first-party plugins. The Air plugins would not be considered first-party plugins anymore because it's made by a separate company now. The company split off from Avid. There are also third-party plugins, and third-party plugins are made by other companies. And this is really where the magic happens, is when you start getting to more and more third-party plugins. This is why, for example, somebody would be able to bounce back and forth between Ableton Live and Pro Tools, but get a very similar sound, is because they're probably using a lot of third-party plugins that they bought from other companies, and that is going to help the sound be more consistent. So if I work on a mix in Pro Tools or I work on a mix in Ableton Live, I'm going to use mostly third-party plugins to get a very similar sound, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which program you use, it matters the sound, the music, the sound. That's the thing that's the most important. So to that end, you want to use the same plugins from software to software. So really good companies that make plugins, famous companies, are Native Instruments. They make a lot of instruments. They make a lot of effects. They're kind of a whole kind of bundle of stuff. I would highly recommend somebody who's starting off to get the Native Instruments plugins very early on, because that's going to help you get more sounds, more instruments, and it's also going to give you a nice collection of effects as well. Another famous company is UAD. I love the UAD stuff. I use the UAD stuff all the time. UAD is all just effects, but it's really good emulations of hardware. So remember we talked earlier about analog versus digital and the sound and different differences in sound and what you can do with it. Well, UAD has done a really, really good job of recreating that analog sound using digital ones and zeros. Another company that's really good at that is Slate. Slate has great effects, and they're also getting some instruments in there. They've got a really great subscription service that you can get all the Slate plugins for, like, as a student, I think it's like 10 or 15 bucks a month, and it's a great collection of lots of different plugin types. I actually recommend that if you can afford like $15 a month, I would recommend getting those Slate plugins. They're great. It's a good price, and they work really, really well. And you can cancel at any time. So if you ever decide that you're not using the Slate plugins, you can cancel your subscription. Another company that's really good is IK Multimedia. IK Multimedia makes T-Rax and Amplitube and Sample Tank. And Sample Tank is an instrument, and then T-Rax and T-Rax and Amplitube are both effects. Another really good company is Arturia. So basically, we will talk about these another time. As we go, we'll talk about all my favorite plugins. But essentially, these are other companies that are making plugins that go inside of Pro Tools, Ableton Live, Logic, FL Studio, basically anything. So when you're listening to music that's on the radio or at the club, that music is not made with the plugins that come with Pro Tools or Ableton Live or Logic usually. Not just those plugins. There are a lot of the native or first-party plugins that are being used, but they're also using third-party plugins. Third-party plugins are very, very important, and I highly recommend that you get into those whenever you can. The final piece of the plugin puzzle here is the plugin formats. There are three main types of plugin formats for Apple computers, and for Windows machines, I think they finally stopped using the. There was another plugin format for Windows machines, but I think they finally kind of abandoned that. I don't think companies make that one anymore. But for Apple computers, there's audio units, which are used by Logic and Live. There's VSTs, which are used by Ableton Live, and there's AAX, which is used by Pro Tools. Now, what the formats mean is this is kind of the plugin type that works within a program. Why did they all make different plugin types? I don't know. They wanted to be difficult. I think it's really silly, but that's the world that we live in. On a Windows machine, you only have VST and AAX. AAX is only for Pro Tools. It is Pro Tools only. Other programs do not use AAX. With an Apple computer, Logic uses audio units, but Ableton Live is more flexible. Ableton Live can use both audio units or VSTs. I personally only use VSTs with Ableton Live because I find it to be more stable. The audio units in Ableton Live, I've always had an experience where they crash more than I'm comfortable with, whereas VSTs hardly ever crash. So my recommendation is if you're using Ableton Live, Biz, I'm looking at you. I know you've got it and you're using Ableton Live. My recommendation is use VST versions of the plugins whenever possible. There are a few plugins that are only in one format or the other, and so you have to use it in that format. But for the most part, if you're buying plugins, those companies are making them in all the different formats. They're making an audio units version, they're making a VST version, and they're making an AAX version. So you don't have to pay extra for it. So if you buy a plugin, it's going to ask you which version do you want to install on your computer, because when you download it, it's got them all there, and then you can just use them. Sushi Monster says, how about VST3? Oh, hey, Sushi Monsters, I think I remember you from before. Says, how about VST3? VST3 is also in there. I didn't put VST2 or VST3 or whatever just because it's the same stuff. So anything that uses VST is going to use VST2 or VST3. It's all the same stuff. It's basically they're different, but the programs will still use them. Ableton Live uses VST3, no problem. It uses VST2, which they just call VST at this point. And to be honest, I'm not even sure what is the difference with VST3. I'm not using it yet because I have found that VST2 is the most stable. And whenever I put some VST3 plugins in there, again, the program starts crashing. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's my computer, maybe it's Ableton Live, maybe it's the VST. I'm not sure why, but VST, I kind of tend to stay away from VST3 unless I need to use VST3. I think what's going to be happening is more companies are going into VST3 and they're going to kind of drop the other ones. So hopefully not, because I like using regular VST plugins, but we'll see what happens. So that's basically that. What we're going to do is we are going to take a break. I'm going to stop the recording here,